So it's a very great pleasure to introduce you to Sheryl Hingorani, who's a senior manager at Sandia National Labs in Livermore. I think most of you know that Sandia does all the non-nuclear work on nuclear weapons, which is 99% of the nuclear weapon. And they're headquartered at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. And they have about 1,000 folks or so.
1,300.
1,300, it's growing. In Livermore, across the road from Lawrence Livermore. And Sheryl did graduate work in engineering at University of Nebraska and joined Sandia over 20 years ago.
31.
31.
I didn't give him a bio, so he's sort of making it up.
In the nuclear weapons program, and has been associated with it for many years. And then in the fall of 2014, she transferred to the Sandia Livermore site to be the leader of the Systems Analysis and Engineering Group. She'll say a little bit about what Systems Analysis and Engineering is at Sandia. It's very diverse. There's stuff on nuclear weapons policy. There's stuff on cyber. There's stuff on autonomous vehicles. There's stuff at DHS and other government agencies. It's a very a diverse group of very creative thinkers that she leads. So today she's going to give us her perspective on the Nuclear Posture Review, the major new statement of U.S. nuclear weapons policy by the Trump administration. And we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. When it's over, Samantha and Molly are going to hand back the exams, and they'll tell you about how to get feedback about the exams. Okay? So please welcome Sheryl Hingorani.
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here to talk to you about something that I think is actually very important. The Nuclear Posture Review that came out last month. Just by show of hands, how many of you have read the Nuclear Posture Review? Okay, good. A few of you have. Thank you. So, and feel free to stop me as we go along. I'd rather not hold questions to the end. If you have a comment or a question, just go ahead and get my attention. And I think we have a way for people, if they are viewing remotely, to do that as well. So I'm going to talk about the Nuclear Posture Review mostly from a nuclear deterrence perspective, because that's really the area of the work at the labs that I've been most involved in recently. But I do want to say that, you know, I have a kind of a mental model of global nuclear security and stability more broadly that deterrence fits into. And I think, you know, in this higher level purpose of global nuclear security and stability, you know, our first obligation is really, as a country, is to demonstrate leadership and commitment to arms control efforts and to non-proliferation and to countering nuclear terrorism and that whole set of very important work. Our second obligation is really preventing accidental or unauthorized nuclear detonations. Third, we have to, the United States of America has to have an effective deterrent to deter adversaries and also to assure our allies. And you'll hear a lot from Brad Roberts when he comes about the umbrella, the nuclear umbrella and extended deterrence commitments that we have to our allies and partners. And then, you know, fourth, and somewhat paradoxically, you know, we have to be able to respond in a decisive military way if deterrence fails and restore deterrence. So there's a whole nother set of capabilities that we need to have that are more about, you know, if conflict were to escalate to the point of nuclear use and thereby deterrence would have failed, you know, how would we respond and how would we restore deterrence? So anyway, this is more from a nuclear deterrence perspective than arms control or some of the other things, but I will talk probably about all of that. So And I want to save some time at the end to talk about the System Studies and Analysis organization that I lead at Sandia, just because as you all are considering your career paths and so on, just knowing what the national labs do is important. So let me start now on nuclear posture review. I'm going to start with the 2010 NPR because I really think the foundation for the NPR that came out last month was really set during the Obama administration. There have only ever been 4 U.S. nuclear posture reviews, one in 1994 approximately, one in 2001, the one that came out of the Obama administration in 2010, and then this one in 2018. And it's really just when a new administration comes in, it's not the only national security document that gets reviewed and updated to match the current administration's thinking, and also in this case, the sort of geostrategic realities that are quite different today than they were back preceding 2010. So for anybody who was paying attention back in 2009, they remember that Obama gave a very famous speech in April of 2009 in Prague, where he talked about his vision of a world without nuclear weapons. He committed the U.S. to leadership in that regard. And he said he wanted to put an end to Cold War thinking. He wanted to reduce the role that nuclear weapons play in U.S. national security strategy. And then he said, and as long as nuclear weapons exist, the U.S. will have a safe, secure, effective nuclear deterrent force for our own deterrence and also to assure our allies and partners. So that did put us on a path. We referred to all of this as, part of the Prague agenda. But basically, I'm going to talk more about the 2010 nuclear posture review on the next slide, but that did come out a year later in April of 2010. Then in 2011, both the US Senate and the Russian Duma ratified the New START Treaty. So this was the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and it limited both the US and Russia to a total of 1,550 strategic deployed nuclear weapons or warheads. Some people in my line of work at the labs and other parts of the nuclear security enterprise viewed this New START Treaty ratification as kind of a trade for budget uplift. So the Senate ratified the New START Treaty, and in return, the Obama administration then supported some pretty significant budget increases to modernize or life extend the stockpile that we had. There was basically an agreement that we could go to smaller quantities of nuclear weapons, but because they were aging and because there was some technology obsolescence in the stockpile, we also had to modernize, and we call those life extension programs, where we're going for each of the systems in our stockpile today, we're working through some life extension programs. Okay, in 2012, at the Nuclear Security Summit in Seoul, President Obama talked about further negotiations with Russia, further bilateral arms control negotiations focused on non-strategic and non-deployed weapons. So the New START Treaty only covers strategic nuclear weapons. We also have non-strategic, or some people call tactical nuclear weapons. And it only covers systems that are deployed. And both countries have, what we call reserve weapons in reserve or hedge status. So then a year later in Berlin, President Obama announced that we could meet our own security needs with an additional 1/3 cut to our forces. So this was really going from 1,550 to 1,000. Stockpile of U.S. nuclear weapons of 1,000 weapons. And basically then in 2014, Crimea annexation put a halt to all of this conversation. So it's really hard to go back and remember, but Brad Roberts, who's going to be here in a couple of weeks, he will say, because he was very heavily involved in the 2010 NPR, we couldn't think of a single path to actual conflict, military conflict with Russia back then. And frankly, now we can think of, a number of ways that a conflict between the US and Russia could start. So in the NPR in 2010, these were the objectives. And even though it wasn't stated that these were in priority order, basically people assumed that this was a statement of priority. So in the 2010 NPR, it basically said the threat of major nuclear war has become remote. And the biggest threat today is nuclear terrorism. Terrorist access to nuclear materials or weapons. And so the first objective of the 2010 NPR was preventing nuclear proliferation and nuclear terrorism. Reducing the role that nuclear weapons play in national security strategy, maintaining strategic stability and deterrence at those reduced force levels, strengthening our alliances and our partnerships and our assurance commitments, and then, last but perhaps not least, but fifth on the list, sustaining a safe, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal. So this really sort of set the tone for a lot of the work that the enterprise that I'm associated with has done over these almost 10 years. And, at the labs and beyond, we use this term always never, which is that U.S. nuclear weapons must always work when commanded and authorized by the President of the United States and never under any other circumstances. As an engineering lab at Sandia, that's a big engineering challenge to design something that's that reliable and also that safe and that secure. But that is what we do at Sandia, not only with non-nuclear componentry, safety components and security components, but also with the warhead system architecture, which is something that Sandia is also responsible for. So one way to think about this is that we've been very focused on the never side of always never under the Prague agenda. Any comments or questions? Okay. Now, these are a couple things that the labs did in the intervening period between the 2010 NPR and the current NPR that I think have had some influence. I mean, you might be interested to know about. There was a tasking from then Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz to the 3 lab directors, asking them to write a report about the future, about deterrence effectiveness over the decades to come. And so we did put a team together, and not to belabor the point, but the labs, the 3 nuclear weapons labs, or NNSA labs, National Nuclear Security Agency, we are really multi-program labs. So Sandia, for example, is a $3.3 billion lab, and about half of our work is associated with nuclear weapons and the nuclear deterrent force. And the other half is spread across programs for the DoD, programs in energy, programs in cyber, programs in a variety of areas. So the labs actually were pretty uniquely positioned to investigate this question of threats to deterrence effectiveness over the decades to come. And I will just summarize our findings by saying there was a set of challenges to long-term effectiveness of deterrence associated with, holding targets at risk. So nuclear weapons are about preventing war, not really about winning war, and they're about deterring adversary use, but you have to be able to hold military targets at risk with your nuclear targeting. And if those targets are, heavily defended and underground, and, there's some characteristics of targets that make them challenging, and our adversaries are trying to do more and more of those things that challenge our targeting strategies. There's another set of challenges so that's more of like an offense-defense stability question, and then there's another set of challenges that are offensive parity, technology surprise kinds of challenges. So we've been operating in the United States under a policy that somewhat prohibits any new military capability in our nuclear force, but our adversaries are not operating under those same kinds of policies. And so there is a risk of technology surprise if, let's say, Russia and China are pursuing new types of nuclear forces and the United States is not. So that's not really an offense-defense stability question. It's just a matter of, well, wait a minute, what kind of technical advantage might they have over the US if they're doing some of these things that we're not doing. And then our third category of findings was associated with asymmetric threats to deterrence effectiveness, and this would just be new threats like cyber and supply chain kinds of attack vectors that we haven't had to worry about in the past. So to make a long story short, we did a lot of work between 2014 and 2018, and in fact, in the nuclear posture review language, there is a statement which I'll read to you that I think will continue this work. It basically says DoD and NNSA will work together to conduct ongoing evaluations of the current and potential future security environment to include threat-based analyses of what potential adversaries are doing or considering today as well as into the future. So that's basically what we were doing with this study, and I think to have it, endorsed in the NPR was a positive thing, and it showed the contributions that the labs had made in initiating some of this work. Another thing we did, the 3 nuclear weapons labs together, is we wrote a set of background papers. We started in September of 2015, thinking about, not knowing who would win the election, but assuming that there probably would be a review of nuclear policy based largely on the geostrategic changes that had occurred. And so without, I'm not going to read that to you, but for about 18 months, about 40 employees across the 3 labs, plus some consultants, we wrote this set of background papers. They were all written with like options and pros and cons of those options. So the labs are federally funded research and development centers, FFRDCs. And which you may probably have never heard of that term, but anyway, we are, sort of obligated to be independent, objective, technical experts that are coming to the table to inform policy decisions, but not to advocate for a specific policy position. We didn't make any recommendations in any of these papers. It was mostly, here's the path we're on today in this area. And some options are, there's some pros and cons of what we're doing today, and some options are you could do a little bit more or you could do a little bit less, and here's how the pros and cons might change under those options. So for me, having been involved in being the Sandia lead on this activity, I can just tell you when I read the nuclear posture review, I see a lot of consistency between that document and a lot of this work that the labs did. And so I'm quite pleased that we were out ahead of that, and that's what an FFRDC is supposed to be doing, anticipating what the nation might need in advance and preparing to support them. So now we have the beginnings of the national security strategy of the Trump administration. You can find that online. This is sort of a nested set of documents now. We have the National Defense Strategy, and there's an unclassified summary that's posted on the internet that you can find. And we have the Nuclear Posture Review, and there are more reviews to come. There will be a missile defense review that will come out. There may be a cyber document that comes out. There will be a number of national security related reviews that this administration is going to do. And, I think we all know that some of the themes of this administration are things like America First. And I'll say, although not alone, because some of the folks in the State Department will say that's their biggest challenge, is helping people understand that America First does not mean America alone. Peace through strength. So if you're going to deter somebody through threat of a retaliatory action, you have to be coming from a position of strength. So I think peace through strength fits with deterrence theory, basically. Although we've talked about different types of deterrence. And then this, I don't remember if it was a tweet or something he actually said, but there was a time when he said, as long as we're a nuclear power, we're going to be at the top of the pack in terms of our nuclear capabilities. So, let me go to the next slide, because that is, this is, I think, though, that, some people would read the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review and then the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review and see a big change. I think there's actually more continuity there than there is change. So, for example, in terms of continuity, I know I have more bullets on the change side, but I still think that, you know, thematically there's more continuity than change. So big things like the triad. We have 3 legs we call a triad of nuclear forces. We have an air-delivered leg, a land-based leg, and a submarine-launched ballistic missile leg of the triad. And people have argued, maybe it's a dyad, maybe it's a monad, do we really need the triad? Well, this is an element of continuity that this nuclear posture review also confirmed the importance of the triad. The U.S. does not have a no first use policy. We specifically have chosen to have an ambiguous policy about first use of nuclear weapons, and that was also, again, rejected, the idea of a no first use policy for the U.S. No changes to our alert posture. In other words, we're not heightening the alert of our nuclear forces, which are at a specific, you know, state of readiness. That was not changed, and some elements of stability, like open ocean targeting and so on, in case there was an accident. There was a change in 2010 from previous NPRs had always said we need a safe, secure, reliable nuclear deterrent. 2010 we changed it to safe, secure, effective, and that was retained. There's some nuances there that I won't go into, but I think that's important. Word for word, this 2010 NPR repeats, this 2018 NPR repeats the 2010 language and the previous NPR language about holding fully accountable any nation state that's found to have sponsored nuclear terrorism. It does affirm what we call the modernization program, but people also talk about the life extension programs. And also the need for infrastructure capitalization. So for example, I think I have a quote here, but I may not be able to find it quickly. But it basically does say, you know, that we're building on the modernization programs that were started in the previous administration, which is quite remarkable. I mean, that's in writing in the document. And this is an administration that's basically, you know, set forth on obliterating a lot of the legacy of the previous administration, but in this case, they actually refer to that. The importance of the workforce is also emphasized here, and this is another point of continuity. And one reason I'm happy to be here talking to you all is that it's challenging. It's very challenging competing for the top technical talent in the United States. The labs competing with the private sector and with academia and other opportunities that you all have to make your careers. And then even though it's at the back of the document and somewhat lower in priority in that regard, in that it's in the back of the document, there definitely is a reaffirmation of our commitments to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, to other treaties and arms control, and the importance of NATO and our allies and partners. In fact, I think the quote in there is our commitment to NATO is unwavering. So some, including me, feel like those 5 objectives in the 2010 NPR are all still important, but they've just been reversed in priority order. So now we're leading with a safe, secure, effective stockpile. And yes, by the way, we also want to be leaders in arms control and non-proliferation. Okay, let's talk about change. So the change here is described, I think, in a compelling way, as being in response to a deteriorating 4+1 security context. So 4+1 is Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, plus terrorism. And all of those things have changed pretty significantly since 2010. It definitely takes the stand that major power strategic competition. In fact, I think the quote from the National Defense Strategy is major power strategic competition, comma, not terrorism, comma, is the #1 U.S. national security challenge today. So there are people who feel that after 9/11 and beyond, that we got so focused on terrorism, Islamic extremism, the Middle East, the Arab Spring, and ISIS, and so on and so forth, that we call it the averted gaze problem. We really were averting our gaze from what Russia and China were doing in particular. And so this is just a reversal of priorities. It's not a huge change, but it's just a change in priorities. This document, the 2018 document, is more explicit about deterring both nuclear and non-nuclear forms of aggression or nuclear aggression, including what they call new forms of aggression, which are things like major cyber attacks and those kinds of things. We can talk about that in Q&A if you'd like to. It still uses the phrases like extreme circumstances and those kinds of things. So it's not really, in my view, I don't see it as lowering the barriers to nuclear use or anything like that, but this change, I think, to have those words specifically there in the document. It does also allow for the potential future need for new military capabilities. We've been operating in this country for multiple decades under a policy that's clear about no new military capabilities. We can life extend the existing warheads, the existing stockpile, which was frankly designed and deployed during the Cold War era, and some might think in some cases is maybe not tailored to 21st century deterrence challenges, but that seems to be changing now with this allowance. 2 or 3 times in the document it talks about the possible need in the future for new military capability. There's much more increase on urgency in this nuclear posture review, meaning schedule urgency, time urgency, and it really downplays the cost. So one of the things that happened in the 2008, 2009, 2010 timeframe is, as I mentioned, the New START treaty was ratified saying we could go to fewer weapons, but they had to be modernized. That costs money. And there have been a number of reports criticizing the fact that we're over 30 years time or so, we're going to spend about $1 trillion on updating and life extending what some people think is a Cold War relic. And so there's been some disagreement about the costs associated with these modernization programs. And in this document, goes out of its way to say, look, this is an affordable priority. It's small relative to the overall DoD budget. It's small relative to the overall US government budget. I think there's a quote from, I won't say who, but one of the Trump administration leaders saying, deterrence costs less than fighting a war. So deterring war is less expensive than fighting war. It does call, I've got a slide, I think next, it calls for what they refer to as modest supplements to our current force structure, and I'll talk about that. And it also makes some changes to the schedule that we've been operating on. There is a pretty significant section relative to previous NPRs on what we call NC3, Nuclear Command, Control, and Communications. And this NPR basically states that our NC3 system was state-of-the-art system when it was developed and deployed in the 50s and 60s and so on, but that today there are some aging issues. It does contain quite a bit of obsolete technology. And it also refers in the document to some diffusion of authority and responsibility within the Department of Defense for NC3. So there is a big push in this country for NC3 modernization, and that'll be happening, over the years ahead, and is already beginning. Another change is it talks about the need for joint conventional and nuclear exercises and training. So, this is also, I would say, somewhat in response to what Russia and China are doing. We've traditionally had, let's say a firewall between conventional conflict and nuclear use. But in Russian exercises, you can look up on the internet the Zapad exercises, in some of Chinese exercises and doctrine, they're taking a more sort of integrated look at the continuum of tools in their toolbox for military advantage, to include even what people call, preparing the battlefield or gray zone type conflict, information warfare. So the question is the U.S. going to adopt this more integrated approach to strategic deterrence? And frankly, I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. If there is the possibility of sort of a war-fighting non-strategic use of a nuclear weapon in an escalating conflict, are our troops actually trained and prepared to fight through, a nuclear environment if that were to pass? And then the last thing I'll point out here is there's some language it came in the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act. There was some language creating a new program called the Stockpile Responsiveness Program. Traditionally, for 20 years, we've had the Stockpile Stewardship and Management Program. And in 2016, Congress directed the National Nuclear Security Administration to create another program called the Stockpile Responsiveness Program. And the purpose was to ensure that as a nuclear power, we have all the capabilities, the skills, the expertise, the infrastructure capabilities to actually do the full cycle of nuclear weapons concept development all the way through prototyping and production and deployment. And so in this nuclear posture review, a few times they strongly endorse the Stockpile Responsiveness Program. So I will pause here for questions. Yes?
You said that this NPR is pretty consistent with what the labs worked on. Are the changes that you've seen also consistent with what you guys worked on at the labs as well?
Yes. I think for people, well, there are going to be some additions to what we've been doing. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think the work that we've been doing under the Prague agenda has been, exactly the right thing that we should have been doing. And also some of the multi-program, some of the cybersecurity work we've done, some of the other, there's something called Conventional Prompt Global Strike. We have programs for the Missile Defense Agency. I mean, I think it doesn't call into question the work that the labs have been doing. It's very consistent with the work we've been doing. Another question?
Yeah, my question was similar. Like, have you seen like a change in your, since you've been at India for so long, have you seen like we comment on like the changes that were made before and after the 2010 nuclear posture review, and then compare and contrast them to the changes before and after the release of the 2018 posture review?
Okay, so the three NNSA labs, which are Sandia, Lawrence Livermore, and Los Alamos National Laboratory, were all born out of the Manhattan Project, right? And so we've existed, I think we just had our 70th anniversary just for the Livermore site. Mm-hmm. And they were strictly nuclear weapons labs for a long time. I started at Sandia in 1986, so I wasn't there in the 70s, but in the 70s during the energy crisis, that's when a lot of the labs started to have a more multi-program nature to them, because we had skills and capabilities and expertise that was very applicable to some of the energy security questions that the nation was facing. And, on kind of a decadal time scale, there were changes to national security needs, and the labs adapted and expanded, frankly, to address some of those needs. So we have we have radiation detection research that we're doing, right, which is about preventing nuclear terrorism. We have, as I mentioned, we have work in support of the warfighter. So we created, as an example, a counter IED capability that's pretty remarkable. So we are here to serve the nation, the nation's national security challenges. That's what we work on. Now, in after the Cold War ended, now if I just talk about the nuclear deterrence part of our mission, after the Cold War ended, and we were talking about this at lunch, there were two things that happened in the early 90s. Cold War ended, and the US took a unilateral decision, a moratorium on underground nuclear testing. So the big iconic challenge for the weapons labs from about 95 to even to now was to develop the computational capabilities and the subcritical experimental capabilities so we could continue to have confidence in the nuclear stockpile without underground nuclear testing. Then when the 2010 NPR came out, so we weren't really doing a lot of stockpile work in that time period. We were really, from 95 to about 2010, we were really developing kind of the scientific underpinnings to retain confidence in the stockpile. Then in 2010, when we had this uplift for life extending the actual arsenal nuclear force, that's what we've been doing, life extending the existing Cold War systems. And now we're going to add a couple of additional things, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. I know that was a very long answer, but did I answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
So I'm interested a lot in the reversal of priority of terrorism versus great power competition. I want to know your thoughts on how much you think that the emphasis on terrorism as our primary threat really deterred nation states from proliferating, and how maybe this reversal might reverse that deterrent.
Well, that's a good question. I would say there traditionally we have said, and I'm not 100% sure this is true, but traditionally we have said you can't deter terrorists. Number one, they tend to be sort of subversive underground organizations, and so what are you going to target if you're going to try to retaliate? And number two, I'm not saying this is correct, but we've said, well, look, you know, they blow themselves up as suicide bombers, so how can we deter somebody who's willing to die for a cause?
Well, I'm more focused on the deterrence of nation states rather than terrorists.
So, okay, so we don't deter, in my view, we don't deter nation states from proliferating. I mean, deterrence is like, so this was an interesting conversation with a colleague recently where he said deterrence is like, don't rob me or I'll shoot you. And coercion is, give me your money or I'll shoot you, right? So there, it's kind of a different thing. So we don't tell nation states, don't proliferate or we'll attack you, right? We work on cooperative regimes, cooperative threat reduction regimes, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Those really aren't about deterrence in my view.
I always saw it as, at least, so my career field has been in nuclear forensics.
Okay.
So the idea is that by placing terrorism as the primary kind of threat, that kind of bolstered our forensic capability in the country. And so the idea is that if a country proliferated to a terrorist organization, we'd be able to attribute that to the
Yes.
country.
Yes.
And so I wonder how this kind of flip will decrease my
Well, again, you know, so the other thing that's happened is the budget request came out, the FY19 budget request. So it's one thing for national policy documents to state things, but the fact is the labs can't work on anything unless Congress appropriates the funds for us to do those things. So I think time will tell. I think it's early. I think there will be changes in some of the priorities. I can just say, you know, the part of the nuclear security portfolio that I'm more familiar with is not on the NNSA side, but on the Department of Homeland Security side. They have a domestic nuclear detection officer, they did. And one of the things that we're seeing sort of hints of in the president's budget request, although, you know, again, Congress has to act, is that the DHS budget, the Department of Homeland Security budget, is skewing toward very operational concerns and less R&D. So I think, you know, it's going to be kind of a confounding of a lot of different factors. If you're going to spend money for a border wall, if you're going to spend money for more ICE agents, you might not have as much money for nuclear forensics R&D, but I'm not sure that's really about this policy change. And we could talk more. I'm happy to talk more about that offline.
I would just say, I don't know if this has been quite responsive to your question, but what we've seen is that in this period where the U.S. has asserted that nuclear terrorism is the top priority, we've seen over the same time period Russia and China adopt doctrines and force deployments in a way to skirt around U.S. deterrent capability, basically to not confront the United States in a direct way, but more in an indirect way with special forces and in the Asia-Pacific area with so-called anti-access area denial strategies. So, you know, the game isn't over. They've just changed their approach to extending their influence at the expense of the United States. And now, although there are constant changes in the personnel of the Trump administration, the general theme is we have to confront these changes by Russia and China.
The line allows for new military capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So is this new delivery systems or is it new actual weapons?
Well, so let me go to the next slide. Oh, well, actually, it's 2 slides in. Let me just say, it could be either, but let me come back to that in 2 slides. So I was just going to read a couple of quotes to sort of reinforce the differences in the security environment. In 2010, this is a quote from the NPR, Russia and the United States are no longer adversaries. In 2018, NPR, it says, Russia considers the US and NATO to be principal threats to their contemporary geopolitical ambitions and leading to a prospect for dangerous miscalculation and escalation. About China in 2010, it said, the US and China are increasingly interdependent and have shared responsibilities for addressing global security threats. This NPR says China's lack of transparency regarding the scope and scale of its nuclear modernization program raises question regarding their future intent. You know, Iran, they talk about the fact that Iran has the technical capability and the capacity to develop nuclear weapons within a year of a decision to do so. And of course, about North Korea, there's a discussion about the explicit nuclear threats to the US and our allies, expanding nuclear missile, chemical, and biological capabilities. So, you know, things really have changed. I would also say, I don't think this is in the document itself, but I think when ISIS was really gaining ground and territory and the caliphate and so on, there was more concern about terrorism. I think that's another thing that's changed, the kind of pushing back of ISIS. So here are what the NPR calls modest supplements to our existing force structure. And Michael's laughing because it depends on your perspective on this. I mean, and I'm happy to take questions or have a conversation about that. So one thing that the document says we need is a low yield warhead that's submarine launched. Let's see. We have low yield capabilities, but the concern here is, and I think it's quite explicit in the NPR, there's Russian military doctrine that people refer to as escalate to de-escalate. Sometimes now people are just saying escalate to win. And of course, we don't know what Russia's planning, but we can piece together from even open source writings, there are things about if a conflict is escalating, a conventional conflict is escalating, and Brad will talk about this, you know, could Russia take the decision to use first use of a low yield nuclear weapon, either in some war-fighting military advantage type way, or even as a demonstration strike. You know, people have speculated even on their own soil, they could just do it as a demonstration of resolve and willingness to go nuclear if we don't back down. And so people are worried that that we don't have anything to deter that type of action, because people think about, you know, the laws of armed conflict and so on requiring a proportional response, military use that's, you know, proportional to the objectives that you're trying to accomplish. And so in the NPR, what they assert is that our higher yield weapons are not a credible response to, for example, Russian use of a low yield weapon, and that we therefore need a low yield, and sometimes they just say low yield prompt, because on a ballistic missile, it's just a faster response time than an air-delivered capability, for example. And then the second thing that's referred to as a modest supplement to our existing force structure is what's called a SLCM, or a sea-launched cruise missile. That could either be submarine-launched, or it could be surface ship-launched cruise missile. But this is not a capability that we haven't had in the past. This is a capability that we retired out of the force approximately a decade ago, the TLAM-N, the Tomahawk land attack missile, nuclear. And so we wouldn't really consider this a new capability, but it's just reverting to something we've had in the past. I would say your question about delivery platforms versus warheads in terms of new capabilities, what I hear is people talking about both, and not that we need them for military advantage today, but a big theme in this NPR is hedging against an uncertain future. That I will just say, you know, we've said our adversaries are operating within our turning radius. I mean, things are moving so quickly in technology advancements, geostrategic changes can happen very quickly, and we're not, you know, as a major power bureaucratic institution, we have a slower response time. And so largely, I think some of the work we'll do on new military capabilities, both at the warhead and delivery platform, it won't be for deployment into the stockpile, it'll be to exercise skills, train the next generation, and put the whole enterprise in a more responsive posture.
So is there any allowance in this, whether it's explicitly in the NPR or supporting documents or elsewhere, for testing? Because if you're going to do new warhead design, and it shows new warhead design, testing is almost certainly going to be a part of what you have to do.
So you're talking about underground nuclear testing, full-scale nuclear testing. Well, you know, so I work at Sandia Labs. We do the weaponization of the nuclear explosive package. We don't actually design the nuclear explosive packages. We don't have to attest to the competence. The other two labs have to do that. I will just say at a high level that, you know, 20 plus years of science-based stockpile stewardship, plus a very deep, rich underground nuclear test history, largely, I think, have put the enterprise in a position where, yeah, we could do things that are somewhat different and still have confidence based on modeling, subcritical experiments, plus a tie to the underground nuclear test database. I do think, you know, we have expectations today for things like margin in our designs, the safety and security of our designs that, you know, that are pretty high. And so even as we do these life extension programs, partly what we're doing, we're not just replacing the old capabilities. We're not creating new military capability, but we are updating things like margin and safety and security. And the degree to which any of that requires underground nuclear testing, that's really for the other labs to answer.
But if I could add, I mean, one thing, this was, folks were wondering about this with the Trump team coming in. So one is they have not called for renewal of testing. And they've even said we're willing to consider the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but the politics aren't right now because the Senate would never ratify it. So, you know, I mean, they could have said very different things. They could have said, we're going back to nuclear testing. And the Comprehensive Test Ban is a pipe dream. But they haven't used language like that. So, but who knows what will happen in the future.
Okay, moving on. So these are, you know, images that you can find on the internet of what we refer to as the current program of record. And I won't spend any time on this, but just to say that these are going to change. So we've had what we refer to as the 3+2 vision, taking all of these air-delivered systems and reducing to just 2 on the air-delivered side, and then a set of 3 ballistic missile warheads. That's called the 3+2 vision. People could give a whole talk about that. And then we have this Gantt chart that shows basically the modernization programs that are underway. This is the $1 trillion investment, although this is just the NNSA side, but between the DoD and the NNSA. And I'm just pointing out that these are going to change. So one of the things the labs have to do is sort of deal with the uncertainty. We had a lot of certainty associated with this program of record that had evolved out of the 2010 NPR. And now it will take probably a couple of years for Congress to act. And in fact, I saw the implementer phase of the NPR is underway. And there is a list of 39, I'll just say studies. Some of them are 180-day studies, some of them are 1-year studies, but 39 specific taskings in order to turn the policy document into a implementation plan with programming, you know, with funding programs for the required work. There are some big implications for the labs in Livermore specifically, and that I thought you might be interested in, but I think in the interest of time, this starts to get into kind of a lot of technical stuff. I'll point out just a couple of things. One is all of the labs have developed quite a bit of cybersecurity expertise, and I think especially with the NC3 modernization that's going to be going on, the labs can really contribute to that. And then I mentioned the stockpile responsiveness program, but I didn't mention this design competition idea. So not in the NPR, but in the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act, there was a National Academy of Sciences study done on peer review and design competition between the 2 physics labs, Lawrence Livermore and Los Alamos, that recommended that we resume this practice of design competitions. And so I think that there definitely will be a team at the Sandia Livermore and Lawrence Livermore labs that will be competing with the Los Alamos, Sandia, Albuquerque team on, you know, something TBD in terms of the actual design competition itself. Okay, I want some time to talk to you about the organization that I manage at the labs, but why don't I pause first and ask if there's any more discussion or questions or comments about the nuclear posture review.
I could just raise 2 questions for you to comment on. One is the NPR has been criticized by arms control groups as advocating the deployment of weapons, low-yield weapons, which lowers the threshold for nuclear weapon use. And because this remains, you know, almost a theological debate, we have no data, but the administration would say we need the low-yield weapon to deter their use of low-yield weapons. Others would say if we have a race of low-yield weapons, it's likely that they'll be used. And once you cross the nuclear threshold, then all bets are off. So that's one issue. The other issue, which was specifically cited in the NPR, was you mentioned that the U.S. would use nuclear weapons to deter non-nuclear attack, and what's cited is cyber attack on critical infrastructure in the United States. So this is a new policy and rhetorical development for an official U.S. document to say we would threaten or perhaps use nuclear weapons to retaliate or possibly to deter a cyber attack on our nuclear power plants, our electric power grids, our air traffic control systems, our energy grids, and so forth. So any thoughts about that?
Yes, I have thoughts about both of those. So let's stick with this one first. I mean, there has been a lot of controversy, that's spilled out of this discussion about deterring nuclear, non-nuclear, and new forms of aggression. And I would just say, it depends on the context. Certainly, the United States is not going to consider a nuclear retaliation to a cyber attack on the Office of Personnel Management files, right? But if there was an escalating conflict with a nuclear armed adversary, and if during that escalation, for example, there was a cyber attack that degraded our nuclear command, control, and communications infrastructure, I would just say we wouldn't put it off the table, right? And so that's the way I see it, is it's just not taking things off the table. It's not precluding that in a specific crisis, in a specific context, that might very well be decided to be an appropriate response. And I think the same could be true on our civilian infrastructure.
Right.
In an escalating conflict, if there was a major cyber attack on our civilian infrastructure, significant loss of life, significant military advantage that was gained in some way through that kind of attack, I think this is just saying it's not off the table. Certainly, these are weapons of last resort in extreme circumstances, and that's in the document. Okay, on the lowering the nuclear threshold, honestly for me, because of deterrence as a concept, it has never made sense to me to say that by having a capability that's more relevant to a certain situation and therefore maybe more, you might be tempted to use it, that's a bad thing. Because all that says to me is then it's a better deterrent. If I have something that's relevant to a particular scenario, and if I'm willing to use it, those are the two things, the credibility and will and relevance of the capability to deterrence. So I haven't ever bought that in the past. I think that it's bad to have something that, I don't think it lowers the threshold, but that's more usable.
Yeah.
Okay. The NPR itself, though, goes out of its way to preempt this, right? And it basically says, look, this is actually raising the threshold for nuclear use on the part of our adversaries. Because right now, an adversary could conclude that they could use a low-yield nuclear warhead with impunity because we would not have a proportional response. So I think they do a fairly good job of making the opposite case. Anything else on nuclear posture review? Okay, so let me just tell you about, whoops, wrong button, about the organization that I manage at the labs. And I tried to change the word so it was a little bit better for an external environment, because mostly I use this at like my all hands meetings with my team and stuff. But it's, about $35 million a year. About 3/4 of that comes directly from external customers and sponsors. About 1/4 of it is actual internal discretionary funding at the labs, because we have the opportunity to spend some of our resources And because the systems analysis and engineering organization, we consider ourselves the headlights of the laboratories, where we're kind of looking over the horizon at some of what the next national security challenges will be. We have to have some of that discretionary money, because federal program managers are not going to pay the labs to do that kind of long-term thinking. They're mostly concerned about the problems they're facing right now. About half is nuclear security related, and the other half is spread across energy, bio, cyber, and homeland security. Approximately 75 people, lots of PhDs from lots of top schools. Distributed workforce. I've got people working in 8 different cities, and about a third with the highest level of clearance. We have hired approximately 15 people in the last 2 years. And basically, one thing that's very important for me is how to steward and ensure capabilities, long into the future in systems analysis and systems engineering. We do quite a bit of modeling and simulation. We have to have a lot of actual domain knowledge in things like energy and cyber and nuclear, so I've got to be careful about that. We have a lot of sort of operations research type capabilities, and we also have good capabilities for elicitation of expert thoughts and advice and opinions on different topics. So this is my workforce, which I think is really interesting. So I have 26 people who have been at the labs for less than 5 years. Is very skewed to the early career sort of workforce. And, it's 16 people, 5 to 10, and so on and so forth. So I have to manage this demographic portfolio that I have in the workforce. And it's actually tough, because if one person over here leaves, like there's me, but let's just say, this individual retires from the laboratory with 40 years of experience. I don't get to hire 40 people. I get to hire one person. And so managing kind of that knowledge transfer, making sure that we have mentoring programs, that we're doing a fairly good job of, onboarding people into the program is important. This is a set of values at Sandia. These are our values: national service, technical excellence, integrity, respect, teamwork, and we say we live safe and healthy lives. But within the systems analysis organization, we have additional values that are important, things like objectivity and independence. So typically, when we do our system studies, we bring that to the decision maker. We say, this is what you asked us to look at, this is what we looked at, these are our results. But we remain independent and objective. We don't typically make recommendations. And frankly, all of our system studies and analysis work could show that you should go this way, and the decision maker could say, thank you very much, I'm going that way. And we have to just be able to accept that sometimes that happens. It could be political reasons, it could be ego, I mentioned earlier. Not hard to say. We do pride ourselves on creativity, collaborating with others, having passion for the work we're doing, making a difference, having an impact. We do value storytelling, really being able to tell a compelling story about the analysis work we've done. And then something we call the end user perspective, which is, for example, if I'm developing an experimental nuclear forensics capability, well, I ought to have visited the border patrol crossings where that thing might be deployed, or I should have been in the helicopters, or I should have been crawling around, at the venue where they're going to deploy some sensors for chem bio attacks, those kind of things. And then these are what we call our mission areas: nuclear deterrence and stability, homeland security, global security, emergent security challenges. We were talking about water security, wealth and income inequality is a big future and current maybe national security challenge, and so on. And then we also provide some support to our own internal Sandia Labs decision makers. So when they're considering, let's just say, we did a big workforce attraction and retention study, and looked at options for providing commuter benefits, commuting assistance. Now we're looking at, you know, housing assistance and weighing some of the pros and cons and risks and rewards of some of these. And I believe this is my last slide, which is just to say, you know, we really do system studies and analysis across the whole life cycle of national security. So early on, we are good at doing scoping studies, you know, asking the right questions. Sometimes federal program managers come to us with funding and they're like, I don't even know what the right question is to ask here. So can you help me figure that part out? We do something we call program definition studies, where we're looking for, cyber's a good example, where we're trying to figure out, okay, how do the lab capabilities really match to what the nation needs, and how can we define a program that would best, you know, serve the nation's needs based on our capabilities. We do some threat assessment and characterization in several areas. Sometimes we're called upon to define requirements for a system or a capability. An example would be the radiation portal monitors that were deployed after the 9/11 attacks. All of our ports of entry have radiation monitors, and those of course are old and aging. And so what are the requirements for the next generation of radiation portal monitors? Scenario planning. Michael has helped us in a variety of areas with scenario planning. An example would be this autonomous vehicle question. You know, there are big discrepancies. There's a lot of uncertainty about the turnover of the fleet and the degree to which people will adopt autonomous vehicles. And so you have to take that, you almost have to take a scenario planning approach to some of those things. Where there's a lot of uncertainty, we do a number of policy related studies, some of which I mentioned earlier. Risk analysis is a big strength of the team that I have. Oftentimes we're doing trade-off studies. We do a lot of decision support and optimization, developing technology roadmaps. So, you know, setting a goal and helping a customer, you know, think through how to mature technologies toward that objective, which could be 10 or 20 years in the future. And then even after something's deployed, we are often still involved in, for example, training and exercises. I have staff in my organization that are literally all over the world teaching chemical and biological security, teaching nuclear security. I've had people in Nairobi in the last month. I've had people in Islamabad in the last couple of months. So people are out training even other countries in some of these key areas. And we have, in some cases, we have 24/7, 365 technical reachback programs. So an example is like with those radiation portal monitors, if one of those alarms, the first thing that happens is pull the guy over, and now let's get the technical experts from the labs on the phone looking at the signature and helping us decide, do we let the guy go? Do we put him in handcuffs? Do we get out the handheld monitors and look more closely? So and same with ChemBio reachback. We have something called the BIRC, the Bio Indoor Reachback Center, and this is where in certain indoor venues in this country we have sensors looking for bioagents, and if any of those alarm, then we have experts at the labs that get together in a specific location with specific systems and passwords to look at what was detected and try to adjudicate what the response should be. So it's quite remarkable amount of work, and it's my dream job for sure. I'm very quite privileged and honored to have the position that I have. And
I could add that in recent times, Sheryl has recruited 2 folks from here, one a graduate with a Master of Public Policy degree from the Golden School, and another woman with a PhD in chemistry who's very knowledgeable at nuclear matters. they've recently joined her group. So,
They've been good additions to the group. One challenge that we are facing, and perhaps you've read about this, is it's taking a long time to get a security clearance these days. You've seen some of the stuff on the news, right, about interim security clearances and so on being granted to people. After the OPM hack, I think one of the 3 contractors was let go. And so the workload is just amazing. I've heard there are 600,000 security clearances in the queue in terms of both new clearances and reinvestigations.
wow.
So we have people waiting sometimes for up to 2 years for a clearance. So I do have a challenge with in this demographic that probably as many as half of those folks don't have their clearances yet. But we are growing nicely, and we will continue to grow. And I didn't spend much time on it again because it's very sort of detailed technically, but the additional work that's laid out in the nuclear posture review, and the fact that in some cases the schedule-wise things are moving to the left, the workload that we were facing was already pretty daunting, and now it's more daunting. And so we will be working very hard to attract and retain top technical and other non-technical talent, and get people their clearances on a timely basis. So we've got a couple minutes, but I think you had some other work you wanted to cover on exams or something, but should I take any other questions?
Sure. Other questions or comments?
Yes.
I think that this organization is outstanding because there is, seriously, speaking as an ex-Livermore person, is there an organization like this at the other labs, or is this really a Sandia specific group?
I don't think there is an equivalent at either of the other 2 labs. It's a very special blend of sort of system studies, which could be, you know, sort of math-based, or they could be expert elicitation or any variety of things, and sort of advanced concepts, systems engineering. And I don't think you often find those in a joint organization.
Livermore has recently started up with Craig.
So Craig West at Lawrence Livermore, they're trying to recreate
It's a
what they
little
call
different.
D division, but it is different. It has the systems and that analytics flavor, but it doesn't have any systems engineering associated with it.
Right.
You've got the tech side, that's a big part of it. I was wondering if Livermore ever used you in any role.
Well, we partner with Lawrence Livermore a lot. I mean, a lot. And I'm very, very proud of that and very pleased. However, I have had a couple of people get hired away from me by Lawrence Livermore, so that's always a risk. But I do think it's very important for the labs to work together on all of these challenging problems, and not just with each other, but with academia and with the national security, you know, feds and so on.
There's a national security office at Los Alamos.
Yes, there is
that does some policy studies, not exactly like this. And then there's the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore that Brad runs.
Right. So
Again,
both of those are very policy
They touch on
oriented.
part of what
Right,
Sheryl does, but Sheryl's is much broader.
I don't think they have this integrated capability. Right.
And it's much tinier groups, it's just a handful of people. This is a substantial group of people.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.